Welcome to the podcast. My name is David Jolly, and today we're exploring the remarkable final act of one of America's most beloved founders, Benjamin Franklin. This is the story of how an 81-year-old man, too weak to stand and deliver his own speech, managed to save the Constitutional Convention from complete collapse with words so powerful that they're still quoted today. It's a tale of wisdom, humility, and the art of political persuasion at its highest level. Okay, let's go back to September 1787, the final day of the Constitutional Convention, and the mood in the Pennsylvania State House is, tense. After 4 months of grueling debates, bitter arguments, and countless compromises, the delegates have finally produced a completed Constitution. But as they prepare to sign it, several delegates are having serious second thoughts about the document that they've just created. While the problems are real and substantial, some delegates think the Constitution gives too much power to the federal government. Others worry it doesn't give the federal government enough power. Small states fear domination by large states. Large states resent the compromises they've had to make to satisfy the small states. Southern states are unhappy with restrictions on the slave trade. Northern states are uncomfortable with the 3/5 compromise. Almost everyone can find something to dislike in the final document. Edmund Randolph of Virginia, who had presented the original Virginia plan that started the convention, now refuses to sign the Constitution. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts lists 16 specific objections to the document and declares that he cannot support it. George Mason of Virginia, the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, is equally opposed. With 3 of the prominent delegates refusing to sign, there's a real risk that other delegates will follow their lead. This matters enormously because the convention's success depends not just on producing a constitution, but on presenting it to the nation with apparent unanimity. If significant numbers of delegates refuse to sign, it will give ammunition to opponents who argue that even the convention's creators did not believe in it. The entire ratification process could collapse before it even begins. It's into crisis that Benjamin Franklin steps forward, or rather, hobbles forward. At 81, Franklin is by far the oldest delegate at the convention. Age and illness have taken their toll. He suffers from gout so severe that he cannot walk, and kidney stones that cause him constant pain. On many days, he has had to be carried to the convention in a sedan chair borne by prisoners from the Philadelphia jail. But Franklin's mind remains sharp, and his political instincts are as keen as ever. He understands that this moment requires not arguments about constitutional theory or debates over specific provisions, but something deeper, a call to the better angels of the delegate's nature and a reminder of what they're trying to accomplish together. Franklin has prepared remarks for his final day, but he's too weak to deliver them himself. Instead, he asks his fellow Pennsylvania delegate, James Wilson, to read them on his behalf. As Wilson stands to speak, the whole falls silent. Everyone knows that Franklin, the convention's elder statesman and most internationally respected figure, is about to have his final say. The speech Franklin has created is a masterpiece of political psychology. Instead of defending the Constitution's specific provisions or attacking his critics, Franklin begins with a disarming admission of his own fallibility. I confess I do not entirely approve of this Constitution at present, but I consent to it because I expect no better, and because I am not sure it is not the best. This opening is brilliant for several reasons. By admitting his own doubts about the Constitution, Franklin makes it acceptable for other delegates to have reservations while still supporting the document. By suggesting that no perfect Constitution is possible, he reframes the debate from whether the Constitution is perfect to whether it's good enough. And by acknowledging uncertainty about the Constitution's quality, he models the kind of intellectual humility that makes compromise possible. Franklin then launches into a broader reflection on the nature of human knowledge and the limits of individual judgment. The older I grow, he says, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment and to pay more respect to the judgment of others. He tells a story about a French noblewoman who, in a dispute with her sister, declared, "I don't know how it happens, sister, but I meet with nobody but myself that's always in the right." The humor is gentle but pointed. Franklin is suggesting that delegates who refuse to sign the Constitution because it doesn't perfectly match their preferences may be suffering from the same kind of intellectual arrogance. He's not attacking anyone directly, but he's making it socially awkward to maintain absolute opposition to compromise. Franklin then shifts to a more serious argument about the Constitution's merits. He acknowledges that the document has faults, but argues that an alternative system would probably have different faults that might even be worse. For when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, he observes, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. This is a remarkably sophisticated understanding of group decision-making. Franklin recognizes that any collective process will be imperfect because it involves imperfect human beings. The question isn't whether the Constitution reflects perfect wisdom, but whether it represents the best compromise achievable among men with different interests and perspectives. Franklin also makes a practical argument about the Constitution's prospects for success. He notes that the document will be implemented gradually, giving Americans time to discover and correct any flaws through the amendment process. He suggests that the Constitution should be judged not by its theoretical perfection, but by its practical workability. But Franklin's most powerful argument is about unity and legitimacy. He warns that if the convention's own delegates express doubt about the Constitution, the enemies of this Constitution will use those doubts to oppose ratification. The success of the entire constitutional project depends on presenting a united front, even if that unity is somewhat artificial. Franklin then makes a clever procedural suggestion that allows delegates to support the Constitution without explicitly endorsing every provision. Instead of asking delegates to approve the Constitution, he proposes that they simply witness that the document was approved by the unanimous consent of the states present. This linguistic sleight of hand allows delegates to sign without declaring personal approval of every constitutional provision. The psychological effect of Franklin's speech is immediate and powerful. Delegates who had been preparing to refuse their signatures suddenly find it much harder to justify their opposition. Franklin hasn't answered their specific objections to the Constitution, but he's made those objections seem petty and unpatriotic in comparison to the larger goal of creating a new nation. Gouverneur Morris, who had been one of the Constitution's most enthusiastic supporters, later wrote that Franklin's speech changed the whole complexion of the business. Alexander Hamilton, despite his own reservations about the Constitution, decided to sign after hearing Franklin's appeal. Even some delegates who maintained their objections found it difficult to refuse publicly after Franklin's call for unity. The speech also demonstrates Franklin's unique position in American politics. At 81, he was old enough to remember when the American colonies were separate political entities with little connection to each other. He had lived through the entire process of American nation-building, from colonial resistance to revolution to confederation to the current constitutional moment. His perspective was both broader and longer than that of the younger delegates who had grown up thinking of themselves as Americans. Franklin's international reputation also gave his words special weight. He was probably the most famous American in the world, known throughout Europe as a scientist, diplomat, and philosopher. When Franklin spoke about the importance of American unity, foreign governments and domestic skeptics would take notice in ways they may not for other political leaders. The content of Franklin's speech also reflects his distinctive approach to religious and philosophical questions. Throughout his life, Franklin had been skeptical of dogmatic thinking and absolute claims to truth. His speech applies this same intellectual humility to constitutional questions, suggesting that rigid adherence to political principles can be just as destructive as rigid adherence to religious doctrines. Franklin's call for unity wasn't just rhetorical, it was practical. He understood that the Constitution would face enormous challenges during the ratification process, and that any signs of division amongst its creators would be exploited by opponents. By securing unanimous approval from the state delegations present, though not from all individual delegates, Franklin helped create the appearance of consensus that would be crucial for ratification. The speech also established important precedents for American political discourse. Franklin modeled a way of disagreeing with political decisions while still supporting them for the greater good. He showed how leaders could acknowledge the imperfections of political compromise while still defending their necessity. This kind of mature political reasoning would be essential for the success of American democracy. Franklin's appeal was also notable for what it didn't include. He didn't make grand claims about the Constitution's perfection or inevitable success. He didn't attack the motives or intelligence of delegates who opposed the document. He didn't resort to threats or ultimatums. Instead, he made a quiet, reasoned appeal to his colleagues' better judgment and patriotic instincts. The immediate effect of Franklin's speech was exactly what he hoped for. When the final vote was taken, every state delegation present approved the Constitution unanimously. While 3 individual delegates still refused to sign, the appearance of state-level unanimity was preserved. This would prove crucial during the ratification debates when opponents argued that even the Constitution's creators had doubts about it. Franklin's influence extended beyond the convention itself. His speech was widely reprinted in newspapers during the ratification debates, and it became one of the most frequently quoted defenses of the Constitution. Federalists urged Franklin's arguments about the necessity of compromise and the dangers of perfectionist thinking to counter anti-Federalist criticisms. The speech also influenced how Americans thought about constitutional change. Franklin's acknowledgement that the Constitution might need amendments helped prepare the grounds for the Bill of Rights and subsequent constitutional modifications. By framing the Constitution as improvable rather than perfect, Franklin made it easier for future generations to adapt the document to changing circumstances. Franklin's final contribution to the Constitutional Convention was also his most characteristic. Throughout his long career, he had been known for his ability to find common ground among people with different interests and perspectives. His speech on September 17 was a perfect example of this skill. He acknowledged real disagreements while building consensus around shared goals. The timing of Franklin's speech was also significant. At 81, he was clearly near the end of his public career, and everyone in the room knew that this might be his final major political statement. This gave his words a quality that enhanced their emotional impact. When a beloved elder statesman makes a final appeal for unity, it's hard to ignore. Franklin died 3 years later, in 1790, just as the new government was taking shape under the Constitution that he helped save. He lived long enough to see George Washington inaugurated as the first president and to witness the early successes of the constitutional system. His final political act had been to help launch the longest-lived written constitution in world history. Franklin's speech reminds us that creating and maintaining democratic institutions requires more than just good laws and smart policies. It requires citizens and leaders who are willing to embrace uncertainty, accept imperfection, and work together despite their differences. The 81-year-old man, who was too weak to deliver his own speech, had somehow found the strength to deliver exactly the message his country needed to hear. Franklin's final gambit succeeded not through force or brilliance, but through wisdom earned over 8 decades of public service and a lifetime of watching human nature in action.